Good evening all and welcome. Tonight we're going to be heading into the woods for a collection of horrors. Be sure to subscribe and press the bell icon and stick around for new videos Monday, Wednesday, Friday and Saturday. But for now it's time to get comfortable. Grab your flashlights and let the darkness take control. I grew up with camping. It is something that I love to do with people my own age. I say this because back when I was a child, I liked to play with the kids in the dirt, the sand, the creeks, etc. And when I was a teen, I liked to be with the other teens and play things like Manhunt, Capture the Flag, and King of the Hill. And now that I'm older, I enjoy chopping wood for the fire and starting it early in the cold morning for everyone before they get up, so that they can have the same fun experiences that I had while I was growing up. Whether in a scouting event, or a church event, or just a family gathering, it's all the same. A good excuse to get out of the house, out of the city and into nature. With that said, I've had some interesting experiences both when I was younger and when I was older. Here is one of them. Back when I was 6 years old, my father was the scoutmaster of the boys' program in our church, and since he went on outings a lot, I was brought along for all of the outings. It was something that I liked to do, so I looked forward to these kind of things. We would find a fun spot to put our tents, huddle them together if we were able to, brag if we found a really good spot, and often make our own respective fires in front of our own tents. My dad was pretty cool about us being noisy all night, since it was supposed to be a fun event. So we would end up doing pretty much whatever we wanted. Just needed to make sure that we had energy in the morning for the next set of rounds, or whatever it was that we were doing. Anyway, this particular time we went up into the mountains for a couple of hours in the California mountain range, and we were hiking our way up the trail to our spot. Now, remember, I was 6 years old. Don't hold me to an adult's set of standards on judging things, but if there was a rule that we had to follow, it was to never leave the trail, since trails in the area we went by are always a straight shot and never had forks in them. It would effectively be impossible to get lost on them, but what ended up happening on this trip? Well, I don't consider myself a particularly adventurous or mischievous person, but I saw a set of boys wander off the trail because they'd found something of interest. I thought it was cool, and consequently followed. Now at the time I had those stupid light-up shoes that lit whenever I stepped, so I was not particularly worried about it getting dark as I ventured off the path. Again, I'm 6. The lights were terrible. They barely even lit up, but at the time I thought they were dazzling, and that they would light my way through the night. I remember very specifically which boys I saw at the time, and quite frankly it was so long ago, I don't mind using real names, as I don't want to be vague. I saw Jeremy, his brother John, as they were wandering in front of me. Jeremy, who was 14 at the time, was looking at the rocks and showing them to his brother who was 12. To me, these were older boys I could trust. So I walked over the rocky mountains, one sharp stone, one small cactus, one prickly bush, and one tri-patch of grass at a time, not giving any attention to the minor scratches, cuts, or punctures that nature was giving me as long as I was keeping up with the boys. I very specifically remember losing track of time as I was anxious to keep up with the cool kids and see what they were up to. At some point while going up the mountain, I noticed that I had lost sight of the boys, so I tried my best to move faster. The feel of the dry, peeling rocks against my hands and the slippery dirt between the unstable rocks of my shoes as I pushed up each rock and slid between each crack to go further up. Well, before I knew it, I was at the top of the mountain. There was nothing left to scale. I had totally lost sight of the boys in front of me and what I assumed would be the best spot to look over the range to see where everyone was. But I saw nothing. Nothing but rocks, dried out plants, and pale dirt. I was lost. I was a lost child in the mountains. I remember feeling myself start to panic, but I tried to breathe calmly as I slid back down the mountain. I thought to myself, well, there's no way I can miss the trail if I just go back down, since I never made any turns. Well, the problem was that I started finding myself going back down some very unfamiliar valleys and crevices. Nothing that I remember traveling up through. I screamed as loudly as I could, for a very long time as well, but heard nothing in reply. I thought it was so strange that no one was hearing me because of how loud I was crying out. I remember having a thought that I would grow to be an old man still lost in the mountains, and that I would have to get really good at lighting fires and catching lizards until someone found me. How to make a rabbit trap, and how to skin it so that I could cook the meat, and if I was really lucky, perhaps learn how to catch something bigger. But I pushed those thoughts to the side, as I was not quite ready to quit just yet. Though the thought of me having to find some rocks to make a fire was pressuring me to do something, since it was starting to get dark. I saw the lights of my shoes a little brighter as I stepped on the rocks going back down. Then, I remembered seeing something. I saw a boy that strongly resembled Jeremy, but it was very clearly not Jeremy at the same time. Like I saw him, but I could tell he had Jeremy's body, but was not Jeremy inside the body. The aura the person gave off was very sinister. He was in terrible shape, thin, almost decaying, and smelled atrocious. "Little boy, why have you strayed off the path? Didn't your parents teach you to not stray off the path?" the teen boy asked. I was honest with him, and said that I was following some older boys that had strayed off, and that I was trying to catch them up, but I had lost sight of them, and was trying to make my way back. I explained to him the path that was supposed to be in front of us. At that point he put his finger to his lips, hinting that I be quiet, and he began to whisper. "Small child, do you know why I am here?" "No. Are you here to hurt me?" The question was a response out of all the horror stories we told on previous camping trips of kids getting lost in the woods, and either monsters coming out to eat us, or bad guys coming to take us to an abandoned cabin where we would be chopped up into thousands of pieces and fed to pigs. "No, I'm here to prevent you to be found by someone that does want to hurt you. However, I can't explain the gritties of how I did it, but you might remember taking a different path than you did going up the mountains, right?" "Yes," I replied. I very much remembered taking an incredibly different path than what I remembered taking when I went up originally. "Well, that is because I led you a different way. Someone here wants to take you away from your family and hurt you in ways you don't want to know about. The same man took me away a long time ago too, in these mountains, and killed me. I remember how scared I was at the time, and I don't want anyone to be hurt like I was back then." The boy pointed over off in the distance and showed me where our cars were parked. My eyes widened like salad plates in relief and excitement as I realized I was no longer lost. I found the trail as well that we had originally walked along as we started. "Go to the truck, stay quiet in the bed, and hide until you hear your daddy call out for you, okay?" I replied with a simple gesture and ran off for the bed of the truck. I remember thinking to myself that it was getting cold, and since we lived in the desert, I didn't exactly dress or pack warm, but I knew that my dad knew everything about packing for camp, so I waited excitedly for him to return so that I could sit by the warm fire and sleep in the sleeping bag that I was almost certainly positive he would bring. And certainly enough, I heard footsteps running to the truck, followed by a familiar call of my name. "Mitchell!" I peeked out from the bed of the truck and saw my dad running to me. We had a mournful and grateful reunion. I was scared that he would be mad for me at leaving the truck, but to my 6-year-old astonished mind, he was not even the least bit mad at me. I was ready to be grounded, and that he would send me home right away, tell my mom what a bad kid I was and whatnot. Goes to show you that Dad cared more about my well-being. But once again, remember I was a kid. I didn't understand these things. I remember how scared and worried he looked. It was a look I never remember seeing him have, ever, in my whole life. I walked back up the trail with my dad, this time not leaving the trail for $1 million, and walked right by my dad's side. I walked up to a spot I don't think I would ever have seen because of how tucked away it is. But the shimmering light of a campfire reassured me that things were just fine, and that the rest of the kids were there and were excited to see me, as they were all told that I was missing. Now fast forward several years, many years of camping behind me now, and I am on the total opposite end of the power pole, so to say. I'm now the scoutmaster, teaching the little rats how to make fires, how to do simple first aid, all the cool kid tricks here and there on how to live in the wilderness. I was talking to my dad on one of these trips, now that he's an old man, and I'm a man in his prime years. We got talking about the one time I got lost in the mountains. Apparently, I had it easy for the scare that day. All I had to do was endure a couple of hours by myself and thinking I would grow to be an old man in the mountains. Yeah, I know it sounds stupid. Any logical person would just go to the base of the mountain, find the nearest road, and ask to be taken to a gas station or something to make a call, as this was before cell phones. But remember, this was a small child's brain. My dad. Here's what happened to him in a nutshell. The rest of the story is from his perspective. Long story short, my dad was walking in front since he was the master of the group and must have assumed I was tagging along with one of the boys since they knew they were to look after me and out for me. Yeah, okay. That was a fallacy that was never repeated after this event, but my dad said he remembered looking back when they had made it to the camping spot and noticed that I wasn't there. Fear hit his gut, and his heart sank like the Titanic. It was getting dark, and his 6-year-old kid was missing somewhere in the mountains. He told me that he ran down the mountain trail, and he had found a note that he had not seen before just off the trail pinned to one of the prickly bushes, a note that scared him out of his mind. I see you left your kid unattended. I guess you won't want him that badly. I'll take him off you. My dad flipped out, ran down the trail completely disregarding the fact that he might trip on one of the many bumps along the way. He said he can almost imagine seeing me just playing with one of the bushes or rocks along the trail. But to his sad disappointment, my after image around each corner vanished, and he kept running. He said he was more freaked out than ever, thinking he had lost me to some creep in the mountains because of negligence on his end. He eventually made it to the point where he saw the cars were parked, and lost all hope. I was gone. Someone scratched me and made me off like a bullet. He cried out my name as he ran back to the truck, getting ready to barrel down the rickety driveway down to the mountains and call the police and get everyone the heck out of there. But what he thought was just another after image turned out to be my head as I poked up from the bed of the truck. He mentions that he didn't share about the strange note with anyone, since he figured it was just one of the boys being stupid and leaving time capsules along the path, since I had noted to him that I left the trail willingly and found my way back and waited to be found with no hint of anyone else being around. It was only logical since the mountains were extremely uninhabitable. Anyone running up and down them at match 5 trying to scratch kids, if they were even there to begin with, since it was such an intense trail to hike, was next to impossible, if not incredibly unlikely. It was much more feasible that it was just one of the kids being stupid and trying to scare everyone with a stage setup for another horror story night of, oh look, this was found along the very path that we hiked. Well, that was what my dad thought. until he had a dream last night when he talked with a kid that claimed he was abducted in the same mountain range. I'm not gonna lie to you, Robert. I thought your kid was a goner. I told him to be quiet and hide in the truck to not be seen, but the guy saw him get in the bed of the truck and was about to get him. If you had not run as fast as you did, he was gonna jump out and dive into the back of the truck to get him. I guess you'd made the right choice there to run down the path as fast as you did. My dad mentioned to the person that they put a strong emphasis on the boys to travel in groups. The person replied that this was probably the reason why the other boys were not targeted throughout, and that he wished his leaders taught him to be in a group, since he was alone when he was taken. Dad said he told the person thank you for helping him out, and keeping me away from the mysterious person as long as he did. Yeah, this is the first time I could actually save someone. Everyone else I tried to help was caught. Take care of the kid for me, okay? The rest of the night after I spoke with my dad about other things, after being wide-eyed for a while, and the same for when I told him the end of the story. I really do believe that there are people out there without bodies trying to do good. I don't believe that most spirits are as the movies try to make them out to be. Some are good, valiant people fighting evil wherever they can, and thank you, whoever you were. I doubt this message will reach you, but at least the spirit of the message might make it to you sometime. I was hiking/backpacking with two friends in Montana. We were probably 5 miles from the nearest paved road and had hiked around 2 miles from the end of the dirt road. The spot isn't well traveled and is quite nondescript, but we all enjoyed getting away from any crowds and being out relatively alone, so we always gravitated to areas like this for backcountry camping. We built a fire and hung out, then piled into our tent. All is normal, and we hadn't seen a soul or any recent sign of people since we left the paved road. I was having some trouble sleeping, and was sort of just laying there for maybe 30 minutes, and both my buddies were passed out. That's when it got weird. I heard from my side of the tent a murmuring, which I was certain was a person making sounds underneath their breath. Didn't sound like real words, but almost like someone drunk and mumbling gibberish. My first thought was one of my buddies sleep talking, but I listened closer, and it was definitely coming from outside. I woke up my friend closest to me, and he woke up with a, "What?" a little irritated, and at that moment the muttering stopped. I shooed him away and whispered to him what I'd heard. He waited a second, and it started up again, but seemed closer this time. He heard it too, but we didn't even hear any sound of movement. I can still hear the voice, and it really messes with me 10 years later. He gave me a, "What the hell?" kind of look, and proceeds to gesture that he's going to unzip the door to see what's outside. Right as he starts moving the zipper, we hear what sounds like someone taking a huge gasp of air before diving into a pool, seemingly from what was the opposite side of the tent that we heard the original muttering from. We both froze for a second before he pushed his flashlight out and looked in the direction and screamed, "Who's out there?" We didn't see anything, and never heard a single twig or any other sound of movement. By this time my other friend had woken up, and we were still freaking out. We told him what was up, and all took our lights out to see what the hell that was. We saw absolutely nothing at all. We were both up for a while longer after, while the sleeping friend was out again, fairly shortly thereafter. We didn't hear another odd sound at all, and in the morning there was no sign anyone had been there. We cut our trip to just the night and moved back to a campground the following day. We still have no idea who or what was outside our tent. The only thing that would make even a semblance of sense was an owl, or bat, or another bird. But I've spent many nights outdoors in that habitat, and I'm familiar with these noises. This was entirely different, and in my opinion didn't come from any animal I'm aware of, and still gives me chills just thinking about it. An old guiding buddy of mine told me this story, and while I wasn't there myself, this happy-go-lucky hyper fella got real pale and quiet while telling it. He would only tell it to me in the daytime, after weeks of badgering, and it was the only time I'd seen him scared in all the months we'd spent leading groups around Appalachia. I've been meaning to share this for a while. He calls it the Gizmo story. My friend Mark went camping in a state forest in Virginia with a group of college friends. They were a small group of 4 from the outdoor rec department, experienced kids with all the necessary gear and familiar terrain. Being college kids, however, they rolled into the campsite fairly late and decided to just car camp. Camping near the car, no hike to a separate location. It was early evening, but still before the sun had set at least. As they were unloading the car and setting up camp, 2 mangy fellas came out of the woods and approached them. These guys looked like they'd been living out there for quite some time. Not that there's anything wrong with that. They acted very odd. They wouldn't look you in the eye and seemed really twitchy, just kind of hanging around like they wanted something, like coyotes. My buddy Mark got an itchy feeling right away. The guys introduced themselves. Now, nobody I've spoken to can remember the first guy's name. It was something unremarkable, like Bill or Rick. But the second guy said his name was Gizmo. Funny name, hard to forget. So Gizmo and his friends start asking questions. Questions like, "You all fixin' to stay the night? How much food you got? When you kids supposed to head home? You got phones? Any more you plan showing up?" Well, Mark didn't like that one bit, so he started telling tales. "Yeah, there's going to be like 8 or 10 of us showing up tonight. Our parents expect us home first thing tomorrow morning. Super paranoid, ain't they? Gotta get home on time or they'll call the cops. You know, parents, am I right? Huh? You know, that sort of thing." Gizmo and company poked around the camp a little bit more and then wished the group good luck and disappeared into the backwoods. Mark and his friends joked nervously about Gizmo and his friend, but weren't worried enough to actually leave. They built a fire, cooked dinner, then cleaned and hung up the bear bag. They spent the rest of the evening hanging out around the fire, chatting and drinking. One of them had a harmonica, and by midnight they had all turned in. They had brought 2 tents, a girl's and a boy's. Well, Mark didn't feel right sleeping in the tent. He felt like someone needed to keep watch, so he lay down by the fire. Sometime later, Mark found himself awake. The fire was dying. When he opened his eyes, he couldn't see much beyond the campsite, except for one bright, burning spot. There were lights out in the woods. It bobbed along at chest height, occasionally disappearing behind the trees, sometimes pausing. Whoever it was at a good distance, maybe 100 yards out. When he told me this story, the distance was between here and that tree, so I can't be certain. He followed for a while until it went out, and he stared at the darkness for a long time until he fell asleep again. Suddenly, Mark woke up again, this time in a panic. The fire was down to embers, barely glowing, and he opened his eyes to try and see the strange light in the forest. It was back, and it was closer now. He could see it was from a lantern. He watched as the lantern carved a smoother perimeter around the campsite, occasionally going out, always reappearing a short distance away. Mark pretended to roll onto his back into sleep so that he could watch. He circled the campsite twice, getting closer every time. The strange thing is, there were no sticks breaking, no leaves crunching. Somebody, trapezing around in the dark woods that close, should have made a lot more noise. Whoever it was trying to be really quiet. Mark lay there tense and unmoving, but by the time it began its third rotation of the campsite, the lantern was so close that Mark could see a face illuminated in it. It looked like one of the fellas from earlier. He couldn't remember which one. His eyes were bugged out, scanning the campsite like a predator, and he was sweating. Then, The lantern went out. At this point, Mark woke up. He got up and started making a lot of noise, stoking the fire, packing his gear, and his watch read that it was 4:30 or so, and the sun wasn't up yet. He considered all that had happened and made the tough call to wake up his buddies and bug out. Nobody argued when they saw his face. Like I said, this guy is a happy-go-lucky, a human golden retriever, and an experienced woodsman to boot. You'd believe him. The sun was barely starting to come up by the time they got into the car, and they were driving out, when they passed something they hadn't noticed on their way in. There was an old RV parked out in the woods, camouflaged with a mixture of earth-colored tarps and actual greenery. It was surrounded by a chain-link fence, which was also draped with camo tarps and leafy boughs. The whole thing looked like a long-term hunting campsite. Mark and his friends were actually relieved. Gizmo and his friend must have been poachers, and that would explain their creepy, stalking behavior. They had been trying to scare the kids away from their hunting site, Scooby-Doo style. Still curious, they hightailed it out of there and counted their lucky stars that they weren't deer. That should have been the end of the story. The next part I don't understand. I don't know why Mark or his friends didn't tell anybody about Gizmo for a few weeks. I would have thought for sure he would have reported the poachers ASAP. He's very type A, and it's not typical for him to procrastinate or let a rule go unenforced. I don't know what his excuse was, but Gizmo and his pal were forgotten. Then one day, Mark mentions the incident to a law enforcement officer from the DNR that came and lectured at one of his classes. She actually casually questions him at first, just being polite, and then stiffens at the mention of the name Gizmo. "By any chance, do you remember the other guy's name?" she asked. "No, it was something normal, I don't remember." "God, they always say that," she replied. Turns out that a part of this woman's job was investigating the murders that occurred in Virginia's state forests. Most are body dumps for crimes that occurred elsewhere, but over the last decade a series of unsolved cases stretching all the way into West Virginia had targeted what appeared to be random unrelated campers. But when they interviewed other campers in the area around the time of the murder, they all mentioned the same uncanny details. They had been approached by an individual named Gizmo and another man whose name no one can ever remember. I was on my first real date, backpacking with my now husband up by Mount St. Helens. We stayed over at this little shelter called Bolt Camp, which is about 5 to 6 miles off the beaten path. You can Google it. You can see some pictures of it with a downed tree that took out part of the shelter. That is the way it is when we stayed there. It's a beautiful hike. The sun was setting as we were nearing the camp. Most of it is dirt path, but there are a number of places where there are little wooden bridges. Every time we'd cross one, we'd say, "Watch out for trolls." Many of the trees had hollows at their bases, and as the sun went down, it would shine through them, creating the illusion that they were little hobbit or fairy houses with tiny fires burning at tiny hearths. As it got dark, we started seeing phosphorescent mushrooms glowing in an eerie green. It's a really neat little shelter. Dirt floor, but probably high enough for 6 people to sleep in. Sans the downed tree. I think it has since been rebuilt. The last people left a half bottle of scotch behind, which we partook of. When we left some weed and a few bottles of water behind, kind of a take-leave sort of place. Anyway, we went to sleep in the shelter. He was towards the entrance and I was towards the back. I woke up at some point. It was pitch black, and I was facing towards the back of the shelter when I saw it. It's hard to describe. It looked like a spiderweb floating through the back of the shelter, sort of geometric shaped, floating around, changing shapes and sort of flipping over and swapping end to end. I wasn't afraid of it. In fact, I really enjoyed watching it. I'm an atheist and don't believe in ghosts, but I laid there thinking that it must have been some kind of spirit. I wanted to wake him up so he could see it too, but I didn't know him that well and figured he'd think I was crazy or wouldn't be able to see it. I watched it for a few minutes, then drifted back to sleep. A few months later, we were talking about our trip, and I finally told him about it. His mouth dropped open. Apparently, the very next night after we returned, he was outside of his house having a smoke, when he saw a thing that matched that exact description floating and drifting along. It finally sort of poofed out of existence in front of a bush. In its place were glowing red eyes. It did freak him out, so he noped back to the house. We've never seen it again. I was camping with family and friends up in the mountains, sharing a tent with my brother Luke and another friend called Evan. Luke, Evan, and I weren't tired when everyone retreated to their tents for the night, but the fire was dimming out and we were bored, so we went into our tent to watch Adventure Time on my laptop until it died. We all passed out after a few episodes, and I woke up sometime during the night to an episode of sleep paralysis. I've had weird sleep habits and experiences every few months or so. For those who haven't had it, basically you're awake but can't move and sometimes experience auditory and visual hallucinations. I was aware of this, so I didn't have a heart attack when I started hearing shuffling noises outside my tent, which continued to get louder and closer until the fabric of the tent itself was being touched by something. My computer hadn't yet died, so I could see my surroundings in the dim light of the screen. I watched the fabric compress as something pushed against it sporadically, about 4 feet off the ground, then moved around the tent towards me. I watched 3 distinct impressions follow this creature around the side of the tent. It looked like a claw. I was terrified and filled with adrenaline, but another part of me remained calm, assuring my body it was all a dream. I couldn't do anything anyway, so my fear was pointless. But as I continued to observe in my sleep paralysis, it began to fade, and I realized I could move. No longer so convinced I was dreaming, I reached over and shoved Luke awake. I tried to get him to look to see if there was something there, but I must have sounded like I was sleep-talking because he just rolled over and went back to sleep, waving me off. Eventually the rustling stopped, and I was tired and groggy enough that I quickly fell back to sleep. In the morning I'd completely forgotten about it. That is until my brother-in-law, who was in the other tent called Dean, said to us, "It's a good thing we put the dog in the car last night. There was a bear here while we were sleeping." Dean pointed out to the tree where we'd strung up our trash so animals wouldn't get to it, and the fresh, gaping claw marks about 9 feet up the trunk. It hit me like a truck. I had seen the bear and calmly watched it test the fabric of my tent 12 inches from my face. This happened at least 11 to 12 years ago, when I was 20 and in a really bad way. I'd been messing up my life via heroin for the past year, but after lots of help, love, and luck from friends and family, I was finally getting my head cleared. Almost there, above the black tar hell I'd gotten myself into. I decided to get out of the city and drove 2 hours to a smaller town in Missouri, where Google Maps told me a small campsite by water was. I knew there shouldn't be very many campers because it had just gotten cold, about 40 or so at night. Nearly there. As I'm driving down a misty morning road, just a picturesque straight 2-lane highway, there's this object lying in the road about a half-mile up. I slow my approach and can see it's this shaggy mutt just hanging out. I stopped and rolled down my window next to it. She came up, licked my hand and wagged her tail a bit. She seemed to expect something of me. She had no tag, no tattoo for Chip, as I checked later, and was just a dog with no name. Naturally, I propped open the passenger side door for her, and she was glad to hop in. So now I had this dirty but friendly companion for my little excursion. The dog with no name. The entrance to the campsite was only a half-mile further. As I suspected, there was no one around. I just dropped a 5 in the honor box and picked the site closest to the stream. I set up my tent, the same one I'd set up for years with my dad as a kid, collected some dry sticks, not too hard to do this time of year, and started a fire. The dog with no name just circled the campsite, looking content enough to sniff some leaves and roll around in the mud. I went to check out the rivulet, about 30 feet wide. It had a man-made stone dam that you could walk across. To the west was the deeper part of the river, sort of pooling at the dam, then maybe an 8-foot drop to the east into the calmer streams. Instantly I wanted to go on, cleanse myself, symbolize, baptize, whatever. I grew up Catholic, so that kind of stuff runs through my head to this day, though I'm far from religious. The dog sees me scoping it out the whole time from the campsite. I can't bring myself to do it though. I'm hugely disappointed in myself, but it's cold, it's brackish, and I don't have a towel. So I get back up, smoke cigarettes, eat hot dogs, pet the dog with no name. Night falls quickly after all this meditation, and I roll inside the tent to sleep. My buddy sleeps inside the tent next to the sleeping bag. This dog was awesome if you couldn't tell that yet. I wake up for no reason, and my main source of warmth, the dog with no name, is missing. I slide out of the tent. I guess I must have left it unzipped. And there she is, just sitting, waiting for me, in the pitch black, wagging her tail. I feel very strange, like something is happening here, and someone/thing is telling me to get back down the river and do the damn thing. We walk down the short trail together, surrounded by Missouri black. It's even colder than before, but I start to strip away, standing on the chilly stones of the dam. The dog with no name sits on the edge of the river, again just watching me. A slight wag. I'm now stark naked as can be, staring into this black pool that looks like some supernatural ink. I should mention here that I hate swimming in water that I can't see the bottom of. My fearful imagination takes over me and I freak out. In other words, I stand naked on the dam for over 10 minutes before I finally muster the balls, albeit shriveled and tiny, and say, screw it, and dive into the blackness. It was cold as hell. It was scary as hell, and when I come up for air, I was thrashing wildly back towards the dam, scrambling back onto the slick stones. I shook out my hair, and was surprised how the adrenaline helped keep me warm. As I picked up my clothes and shoes, I looked over for my buddy at the river's edge, but the dog with no name was nowhere in sight. Back up at the campsite, I'm looking around, gently whistling, that kind of thing. I'm more than awake now, so I go ahead and start another fire. Dawn is just beginning to break. I have another hot dog for breakfast and figure I might as well pack up and leave. This trip feels more than complete. As I start my car up and check my phone, there was an hour time difference between the two. This happened to fall on daylight savings time. I'm not calling it a supernatural rip in time, but it's funny that this was the night it went down on. In fact, the exact time would have been around 3 to 4 a.m. when the dog vanished. The dog never showed up again, and I never shot up heroin again. My friends and I used to camp at this abandoned campground. I'm not sure who found it first or why, but it was free and that's all that mattered. I arrived late the first night, so I have always bunked awkwardly with several people in a tent. We just finally figured out how to arrange themselves so the guys weren't going nuts to butts when we heard it. Opera music, full orchestral accompaniment, and a beautiful, though faint soprano voice. No one else had been in the campground when I got there. I was the last to arrive well after sundown and there were no houses around. A river bordered one side and a large river valley farm was on the other. It was eerily silent all night until the opera started. The second year we went there, we expected more singing, which we got, but only on the first night, which was still super creepy, but we had been expecting it. But that year we also got a campsite filled with owls. I've never seen so many owls in one place in my life. There had to have been at least a dozen of them. I felt like I was in Harry Potter. They didn't seem to be afraid of us since they lingered every single night observing us. as we were making dinner. It can be unnerving to say the least. We never went back to that place, and I've honestly never been able to find it on a paper map. This means nothing, I'm crap at maps, but nonetheless, really, really weird. Where I live, there are huge swaths of forested land that is miles and miles away from any sort of civilization. Being a good old country boy, I spent a lot of time camping along the DNR roads. One year, we were camped out on the side of a little mountain and spent the night drinking and whatnot. The next morning, nobody wanted to cook, so we decided to drive into a town 20 miles away for breakfast. As we were all exiting the forest, we came across a police blockade. The sheriffs had their automatic rifles pointed at us and told us to park the vehicle and walk towards them with our hands out in the air. We followed instructions, and they told us that a forest ranger had been shot the previous night. I later found out that she was shot about 300 feet below our campsite. We probably heard the gun, but in that part it wasn't unusual for people to be shooting in the area. We were told we couldn't go back for our camp gear as the killer was still on the loose. Instead, we drove to a nearby casino and got back to the revelry. A few hours later, the gas station next to the casino was packed with sheriffs, the police department, FBI, and every law enforcement officer within 50 miles must have been there. As it turns out, the killer was spotted at the gas station, and an officer who happened to be there recognized him. When the law enforcement officer told him to get on the ground, the killer reached for his gun, at which point the law enforcement officer shot and killed him. What was so strange was that we were within a few hundred feet of where he killed someone, and hours later, a few hundred feet from where he was ultimately killed. We drove back to the campsite that night a little sombered, then proceeded to get very drunk. I was camping in the bush in Africa years ago. It was a big semi-permanent campsite with big rectangular tents you could stand up in, and we were the only ones there for the weekend. My sister and I were in a tent set a little away from the others, down a short pathway. It was a stunning night, full moon, clear sky, and my sister wanted to leave the tent flaps open. No way. I insisted on closing them. I was woken up several times during the night by lions roaring. It's a sound you only want to hear with something sturdy between you and it. The next morning, a few of the other campers walked up our little path. They were following lion footprints. It had wandered through the main site, up our path, right up to our firmly closed tent door, walked all around the tent, then walked off into the bush. No arguments about closing up the tent that night. While settling in at Sandy Balls as part of my Duke of Edinburgh award, we started hearing noises of bikers, cyclists, not Hells Angels, coming down the path. Now we were at the bottom of the campsite. This place is a luxury site, and they didn't really want a bunch of grubby 16-year-olds, so we were camping right at the bottom of a hill. It was a dead end. It led to nothing but cow pastures. We'd broken the Duke of Edinburgh rules earlier and headed up to the main facility to enjoy the bar and watch the World Cup. I remember Croatia beating someone famous 3-1, if that dates it. A guy called Johnny scored, and we stumbled back to our tent. By this point it was dark, so we shut up shop and called it a night. 3 in their private luxury tent, and 3 in the pauper school equipment tents. For the first hour we kept hearing a cyclist. No lights, no other noise, but a cyclist coming down the path, riding, tinkling the bell, then silence. And this happened several times, each from the same direction, never any return noise. In the morning we got up, looked around, and there was nothing. The place was a dead end. There was nowhere for a cyclist to go. We were a little creeped out by the phantom noises, so we headed off to the nearby creepy abandoned fireplace that was our next waypoint, got stuck in mud, chased by a cow, trapped at a ford, then ended up at a Canadian War Memorial before we were picked up. Hey guys, it's Mort here. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's stories. Some really fun stories for tonight. I really enjoyed narrating them, and I hope you enjoyed listening to them. Seriously spooky stuff. A huge thanks as always to my members and patrons' names on screen. You guys are amazing. And if you'd like your name at the end credits, and to help out with the running of the channel, it does mean a lot, and you can find links in the description to do just that. Thank you all. If something scary and terrifying has happened to you and you would like to share it with me and for it to be on the channel, all that you need to do is email it over or add it to the Reddit. Info is also in the description. Just press the little more button and you get the description of the video and, you just follow the links. Alright then guys, well that's me. For now I'm going to sign off. There are more videos on screen, other stuff you can watch too if you still want to listen. But other than that, stay awesome. And I'll see you in the next one.